Greetings, this is Griff Ruby with yet another Isaac Asimov short story review. This story first appeared in this magazine, of which all I have is a black and white PDF of the magazine. I printed out the relevant pages thereof, but before we even show what the story was, it has a truly unique background among all of Isaac Asimov's stories. He tells the story here in Magic. I'm just going to use the pocketbook here version, paperback, but it's a pretty straightforward account, and he's discussing, of all things, plagiarism. Now, anyone familiar with his works knows that he is not in the habit of going around copying other people's work. He doesn't do that. But sometimes things can happen probably unconsciously, or maybe even just an extraordinary coincidence, where it certainly looks that way, and legitimately so. But let's hear, first of all, the story here. He starts here. It's page 395 in this book. Okay. But I haven't read every story ever written, and many that I have read, I have completely forgotten, or at least consciously. What if I duplicate important elements of stories I have never read or have forgotten? It's possible. I once wrote a short that ended with a certain dramatic climax in the last sentence. Eventually, I received a letter from another writer whose story had been published before I wrote my story, and who had made use of the same dramatic climax in his last sentence. What's more, I had his story in an anthology in my library. I did not remember reading it, but I had had the opportunity to do so. The two stories, except for the climaxes, were completely different, but I promptly wrote the other author and told him that although he had my word that there was no conscious imitation, I would withdraw the story from circulation, and it would never again appear in any anthology, any collection, any form whatever, and it never has. Fortunately, the other writer accepted this, but what protection do I or any other writer have against the accusations of plagiarism over what is a bit of unconscious recall, or for that matter, an outright coincidence? So that happened. He came up with a story. Well, let's start with where that story may have come from unconsciously. Like I said, I agree that he would never have done anything like that consciously, that it could have been a coincidence, but given a lot of similarities, a little more than he lets on actually, it could also have been an unconscious regurging of some story he read, forgot he read, and then he's thinking, I've got a neat idea for a story, and he writes it up in his own way to some degree, but it is still very, very much the same story. So, and he mentions that he had it in a collection. I think it had to have been this thing right here. The story itself came out in a 1952 issue of Startling Stories. It was later collected into this book, published in earlier 1955, maybe late 54, early 55, and in fact appears as the very, very last story of this entire collection. It's in the book. He has this. It's in his library. And who's to say he couldn't have accidentally done this? So, what is this story? Well, let's read about all this a little. This has a little introduction here. This is, by the way, is Groff Conklin's collection, Science Fiction Thinking Machines. So, he writes down here, the other author is named Robert Sherman Townes, and the story was titled Problem for Emmy. Inevitably, the machine as individual must become a preoccupation of the science fiction writer. particularly since scientists themselves were already in the habit of thinking of their large computers as individuals and refer to them by personal names and intimate pronouns. Jonathan Leonard's book, Flight into Space, has a vivid passage on this very point, but Mr. Townes shows a more delicate and much more imaginative perception in this little story. With all that we do not know about thinking, about the brain, about consciousness, about individuality in the human being, can it be said that Emmy, which is the name of the computer in this story, is impossible? So let's start with a little bit about this. Emmy lived, as we all use that word, in a great room that had once been the university's ROTC armory. The walls had been painted pale gray, and a few partitions and glass cubicles had been set up, but the shape and vast reach of the old armory remained unchanged. Emmy almost filled the width of one end, standing a good 15 feet high and coming out into the room over 20 feet to the edge of the heavy carpeting. To the casual eye, Emmy was no more than several huge gray-enameled steel boxes with panels of tiny lights, a few switches, one large red light. It would have been difficult to explain to an outside, and Emmy was silent, the reverent hush of the white-clad servants who attended her day and night. Emmy had a much longer name, the Mandecker Golemacher Electronic Calculator Implemented Model MVII or 7, but those who worked for her and for whom she worked had shortened that all to just Emmy. Not alone from a need for brevity, but also because of the strong sense of personality that pervaded the immediate area of the great mechanism. So you have, and then let's start with the commonalities. In both this story and the one that Asimov has later on, you have a computer, the brightest computer on the face of the earth at the time. In this case, it's on some university, and you have a professor who is in charge of it, maintaining it, adding to it, and making it grow better and smarter and stronger and what have you. There's a fleet of technicians who are keeping it clean and maintained and quickly, replacing any tube that burns out or what have you. And there's also 6 mathematicians whose full-time job in that position there, they occupy the 6 cubicles on the rest of the room that doesn't have the computer in it. Their job is to provide the inputs for it, so as in the language that it understands, so that it can then produce the answers in its form, and they take that and interpret that and present that to the world, or whoever has come to them with some particular computing need. And you have 2 characters in here, the main one being Dr. Adam Golemacher himself. His predecessor has already started this machine, is apparently already gone, and that predecessor was Mandecker. So Golemacher is now the one who is in charge of the machine. And then there is another figure from whose story is told. This other figure is going at first person in this story, whose name is simply Dichter, anyway, who is the assistant to Dr. Adam Golemacher. Now, Adam Golemacher has watched this Emmy computer come up from being developed fairly crudely to being more advanced. I, being Dexter, had no part in Emmy's creation. When I joined the staff in the room, the machine was a performing entity, a complete, handsome thing for all its size, trim, and tidy in the sleek steel housing. The walls nearby were muted with smartly dotted soundproofing that made a fine setting for Emmy. I liked this ship-shaped, cleanly place. Let me note here one other thing. I've seen a copy, I don't have the actual here to show, but a reprint of the pages from Startling Stories, and I noticed there were a lot of languages, spelling, little grammatical boo-boos all over the place. In this collection, those things all appear to have been cleaned up. Whether they're in the original draft or just some typesetter's problem back in Startling Stories, I don't know. But it's good to see that stuff cleaned up. But this one last thing kind of still here. Cleanly place. This is a cleanly place? Okay. That's the only one of all those that seem to remain in this copy of the story. Salary is not high, but Adam Goldman is one of those men who educate with their mere presence. It was said everywhere that mattered that he knew more of this intricate and exquisite science than any man alive, and I have good reason to believe it. So it's describing what they do, how they work it, how things go, and just a few little adventures that happened. Like one time, Dictor was humming London Written. It actually mentions the song later by name. And the computer, hearing that humming, attempted to compute that, and it got very, very goofed up by that. It couldn't make sense of it, and well, they had to, I guess, restart the machine or something, reinitialize it, and then put it back to being okay. But it was still like, you have to be careful what you do and say around this thing. Okay, well, lesson learned. Anyway, they had some kind of a electric eye on this machine at some point, and it could look through the windows of the room, and it's on campus. You see stuff going on with the students outside, and so on and so forth. So maybe the computer sees something and may respond to it. At one point, they actually close the curtains so that the computer can then focus on the specific job that's been given to him, which then it does. And the little lights go on, and then it starts kind of doing different things. And it ends with, well, they would also leave it kind of idle sometimes and just let it do whatever it seemed to want to do out of whatever random, who knows what, going on inside all many, many circuits. And suddenly, what's happening here? Now, I could not mistake the pattern. Perhaps I really had known it once, and my mind played for a time that was running away. The pattern was simple. 1 and 1 is 2. 2 and 2 is 4. 3 and 3 is 6. The little sums set forth haltingly as a child would make them with marbles, a very small child. But Emmy could do sums beyond the reach of any human brain. Emmy could do anything that she was told. In other words, it was just doing this funny little 2 and 2 is 4, 3 and 3 is 6 business, without somebody telling it what to do. It just decided to fill its activities with that little, kind of like a nursery school game. And Dr. Goldman was very, his heavy face was tired, pinched. He's very concerned. Now, there's one more thing. You've got the senior figure, the main professor in charge, the mentor, the more experienced member of the two main characters, because these other technicians and mathematicians that are in the room barely factor into the story. It's mentioned that they're there. That's the extent of it. The computer does something. I'll get to that shortly. But now let us compare Isaac Asimov's version of the story. As I said, it appears in the March 1955, it actually says so right there, issue of this very ancient computer magazine called Computers and Automation. So it's got everything from cybernetics to robots to automatic control. And there it is. This is the table. Contents on the cover. You can see the very first thing item listed there is Question by Isaac Asimov. Well, let's see what he did with Question, his story. He decides to tell a story about a great supercomputer. In his case, it's a government project, a massive government project, and we would later learn, and it's a secret government. Its location is secret. The fact of its existence is not a secret, but the location is very well protected and kept out of public view. Nobody knows where it is except for those immediately involved in working it, or otherwise have some very important and overriding reason that they should be allowed to know where this thing actually is. And this story has a curious distinction of being the very first story about a subject matter that will surface time and time again in Isaac Asimov's writings. Now, what is this thing? Well, we're talking early 1950s, and again, we actually go back to 1952, same year that the original story by Mr. Townes appeared, that for the 1952 election, it was said that a certain computer was used to tally the results. That computer is actually advertised, or one like it at least, in this magazine here on page 5 as a Univac. Now, you might, if you study the history of computers, you know that Univac is a very well-known, very old computer. And there's kind of a picture of it. You got, let's see, you got tape drives, you got all these big cabinets full of the central processing unit and who knows what all else. You got a typewriter, which, maybe it types out there, or maybe that's where you make the punch card that it reads. And it has another desk-like unit here that appears to be where the punch cards that it reads would in fact be read, and or they could be edited there. I don't know. At any rate, you had this room full of great big equipment. That was a computer, and it's mind-boggling to think that that computer, huge and hairy as it is less than 10,000 of what most people today have in their pockets. And by which I mean the little phones we call it. So Univac was a well-known thing. So Asimov decides to improve on that by going one step beyond. Uni is one vac. Let's make it many. That makes it obviously more advanced. For one thing, you could have multiple processors, which would enable parallel processing. You take a big computing task, and maybe there's different chunks of it that are sufficiently independent of each other that you could just do these chunks separately. And then later on in the computation where they have to interact to bring them all together. And that means however fast your computing power is, you just have or more the computing time. You see, parallel processing. So it will be much more powerful computer, much more capable of looking at many different things simultaneously. So he decides to develop a supercomputer that will appear in a great many stories of his. It's actually like a kind of a semi-series, if you will, of stories about a computer called Multivac. But this is the very first Multivac story, and it was titled Question. So there we are. Question by Isaac Asimov. Okay. Waltham, Massachusetts. Okay. And there we have the text of the story. It's all, the whole story is on a mere 2 pages. So it's very, very short. So, what does this have in common? One is the idea is, again, this is the greatest computer on the face of the earth. The most powerful, smart, intelligent computer in existence. 2, you have 2 main figures. Indeed, the way this is written, I don't know if anybody else is in the room, although it seems to be at least an implicit suggestion that there's got to be other people in the room, technicians and so forth. We have another thing for this. This computer is half a mile long, a quarter of a mile wide, and 5 stories tall. So it's filled with tubes and relays and wires and stuff running every which way imaginable. There's even little nooks and alcoves, so giving the technicians who go around through it, maintaining it and whatever, the room to stop and take a little drink or a snack or sandwich if they carry it along with them, on the way from one place to another. It is just so huge you can have little places like that. Now, this story not being published anywhere, I'm not going to give the whole story, but I want to focus particularly on those that focus on this as a Multivac story, since it is the first. It introduced the Multivac, and it's only the similarity, the extreme similarity, as it turns out, to this other story that caused him to say, oh, this either is plagiarism or at least it looks like it. I will not circulate this any further. So, it's the greatest computer. That was one thing. In this case, it's really huge and on the government, price tag instead of at some school and just some professor somewhere doing this thing. Another big difference is, you've got, well, another similarity is you've got two characters. The more senior member who kind of seems to be more cynical. He's seen it when it was just a machine. You had to input everything a certain way and it had to output a certain way. And he's seen it grow. And there's some of the, that'll be history discussed here. I'll actually read that part. Then you have a more junior partner of all of this, for whom the mystique of this smart thinking machine has consumed him, and he almost feels like he's being stared at by some sentience, some actual being. The idea is, supposedly, if you get enough of these circuits and switches and everything else that makes it up, you get closer and closer to something that would be, let us say, like a human brain with all of its, 14 billion neurons or something in there, all flashing away in their different ways of doing whatever it is they each do. And the feeling was at the time that as you get to that large number of neurons, that much intelligence and so forth, somehow some kind of a selfhood or sentience would kind of emerge from that somehow, just spontaneously. We saw a little bit of that a few stories ago in one called Nobody Here But, which also featured a very strong computer called Junior. And it was like its intelligence was so strong it became almost like this weird spiritual, ghostly presence associated with it that enabled it to actually cause the screws in holding the front panels on to either not allow themselves to be unscrewed or to begin unscrewing themselves on cue, even though they have no motive machine to do that. I mean, our intelligence exists. We have the power to move our bodies, to make our arms and legs and other things move as we choose to. Maybe a computer, if it has enough of a sentient intelligence, could somehow do the same kind of thing. It makes for an interesting picture if you were to make a movie. You see these screws just spontaneously going coming out of the computer, on their own, as it were. But it's the intelligence of the computer somehow doing this. But it's really not realistic. I mean, I can move an arm because I have a nerve connecting my brain to the muscles in my arm. It's a very specific chain of command. How do you get from the intelligence that this thing, let us suppose it had at the central processing unit, or whatever part of the computer you want to assign such a thing to, what connection does it have to the screws holding on the front panel? So that's another kind of thing. A bit of personal experience. I kind of tended to think that way myself when I was much younger. I can remember hearing about the neurons of the brain and thinking, all of this is the product, all of what we are is purely and completely nothing more than the product of what there is physically. Because, and this was the rationale, listen to this. We got 14 billion neurons in our brain. Now that's either enough to be all of who and what we are, or it's not. If it's not, well, then what is? Well, certainly not some weird, ghostly, what is the soul? Is it this ghostly, or spirit, or is it this ghostly thing that kind of floats around, or maybe it kind of gets unaccountably fixated or attached to a hunk of meat for some reason that happens to be alive? Is it some weird ghostly thing? How is some totally ghostly thing, continuous in its substance, somehow going to have the complexity to be a being? That couldn't be. So it must be all those 14 billion neurons that do that. Well, we probably have as many circuits in our typical little smartphones today, right now, and they don't have any intelligence to them. They don't have any selfhood. They don't have any of these kinds of things. They don't acquire a sentience. They don't acquire a selfhood, a sense of I as a being who has a stake in what happens to itself. So, if that's not enough, is that really who we really are? Probably one other way to illustrate what could be. Picture somebody's playing a video game. In the game, there's a character. By manipulating the controls, they can make the this way and that, punch somebody, shoot somebody, whatever, do various different things. And they can maybe get hit by other characters inside the game, which can attack them. They can have so much health, they can take so many blows before they're just injured, or finally the final injury is fatal and they're dead. Game over. Okay? The difference is, game over, that little figure has died. But the guy playing the game is still there. It's like chess, except that after checkmate, you're still around. Maybe there's something like that, which would not be just some phantom ghostly something, but would be whatever it would take to have a selfhood. I don't know. This gets into areas that no one really knows. But one thing we're finding is that no amount of circuits, at least certainly computer type circuits, seem to be capable of creating a sentient being. Perhaps if we try to simulate one, we could do that. We kind of have some things you can turn on to, like that you could type, that you could speak to, and it will kind of talk back to you. We have programs that kind of look this way, and sometimes it can get almost spookily like they are kind of sentient. But it's all programming. It's not like a being that actually feels things the way a living being does. Even something so simple as your dog or even your pet chameleon or something, But that was often the thought. And apparently, the more junior members in both of these stories are kind of willing to think that maybe somehow these computers will get characters. Just from a character or a personality, a selfhood, if you will, a sentient selfhood from all these many, many, many circuits. Whereas the more senior member, they're more cynical about all that. So let's look at some of this stuff about Multivac. And like I said, as you'll see, the Multivac stuff itself really, it's a great computer, but beyond that, it's different. It is that part is different from the previous story. And like I said, since it is the first Multivac story, I think it is worth allowing the people to see what Multivac was like and how Multivac was introduced to the world. So I will read. Let's see this story. The corridors within Multivac were commodious and well ventilated. There were even nooks where a technician could pause to eat his sandwich and pour a hot cup of coffee for himself out of his thermos bottle. But Ben Lelancy was always a bit uneasy when he interrupted a hard day in that manner. It doesn't seem right, he muttered. I get the feeling Multivac is staring down at me and doesn't like it. So Ben is the younger, inexperienced guy who thinks Multivac might have an intelligence, might resent him using these little areas to give himself a cup of coffee. Okay. So that's Ben is obviously thinking this way. Joe Ciali, he's the more experienced member here, the more senior member, who was an old hand as computer technician and who could actually remember the days before Multivac could talk, found statements like that revolting. Okay. He said, the trouble with you, Ben, is that you let size impress you. He moved his hand in an upward arc. You let size impress you. Okay, he just saying it like that. Yeah, okay. Alright, nothing. Just size. Just a billion tubes. 2 billion relays. 4 billion circuit complexes. And nothing. In here, he tapped his forehead gently. Everything. I know that, said Ben, troubled. He looked about him. He didn't see the end of Multivac in either direction. It was half a mile long, a quarter of a mile thick, 5 stories high. It was the world repository of all knowledge. The Library of Congress was all but obsolete. See, it's like we're practically fixing to replace the Library of Congress here. That's a government operation. That's not something you do on some local campus by some single professor who just happens to be very smart. So this is definitely a much larger scale project. But again, you're looking at this is the smartest computer in the whole world, which both claim to be in their respective stories. Okay. Continuing. Okay. I know that, said Ben, troubled. He looked about him. Oh, I took the size. Okay. The smallest junior college, any village factory for button hooks, could plug into it and learn whatever could be learned. Problems in economics and sociology that were too complicated for a generation of scientists even to approximate were solved by Multivac in a matter of minutes. Wow, factories to make button hooks. You could have found those in 1955 and lots of neat things. I don't know when we'll have that again, but I didn't think we're going to have to do that. We really should. Joe watched Ben's eyes and seemed to read his mind without trouble. Sure, he said, it solves problems, but only when we set up the proper relationships, feed in the pertinent data, adjust the circuits for necessary correlations. After that, it's just electrons following lines of least resistance. What more is the human brain? Demanded Ben challengingly. Ah, but the brain isn't half a mile long. It fits in one skull, and the human brain can create. A human brain wrote Hamlet, and human brains built Multivac. There's no comparison. A machine is no more than a machine, whether it's a lever or Multivac. They sat on little stools, their backs against the smooth wall of the resting recess. All about them were the glowing indicators whose ever-changing patterns of light acted as guide spots to the immensely complex electron flow that twisted and writhed within Multivac's vast interior. Multivac was, quote, on its own, unquote, now. That is, no question was being put to it, or would be put to it for some time. It was making correlations at random. Ben stared at the steam curling lightly from his coffee and thought of that. He said, it's awfully quiet today. No correlations, I suppose, said Joe indifferently. I don't like it when it's on its own. I keep wondering, what's it doing? What's it thinking about? This is your problem, not Multivac's. Random correlations. What's mysterious about it? It's like giving a person so many hours a day off his job in order that he might spend his time thinking quietly. Well, all right, you admit Multivac and think. Joe Ciali snorted. No, just a metaphor, Ben. It happens not to be thought in any literal sense. When you throw in the random correlation circuit, all you're doing is letting an electron flow be determined by the chance effects of thermal noise. Throw the dice and see what turns up. Turn the kaleidoscope and watch the design. Set 20 million billion monkeys to work on 20 million billion typewriters. And as though on cue, Multivac's quiet, resonant voice filled the corridor. It said, George Washington was father of his country, but had no children. Joe laughed, and the echoes of his mirth rasped sacrilegiously against Ben's ear. Ben said, Stop that, Joe. Joe subsided into a grin. It's funny, isn't it? Why not laugh? There's your example of random correlation for you. Multivac had the datum that George Washington is called father of his country. He also had the datum that Father George had no children. He put the two together. Okay, and here we have Ben going, and sounded surprised, said Ben. It seemed an incongruity to him. He's been thinking about it. Oh, you're hopeless, said Joe. Multivac can't sound surprised. His voice isn't fitted for inflection, and he can't think. He just correlated two statements containing an element of contradiction and therefore connected them with the conjunction but. He just made a special case of the statement A, but not A. He looked at his watch. Well, 15 minutes more and he's off his own, back on informational utility, and then you can stop worrying. He yawned. But Ben put his elbows on his knees and buried his chin in the palm of one hand. He's too quiet. That's the only thing he said. After all, he's getting bigger all the time. More circuits, more data, more refinements. When he started, he could accept data only when it was reduced to binary puncture patterns. He could only give out answers in the same way. Then it could print words instead of having uh, instead of having to make patterns. Then it could throw words on a screen. Now it can speak words in any of 10 languages, and it can accept spoken data. So these are people who've seen this progress of this computer just in their own lifetimes. It's really become smart. Well, what of it? How much bigger, how much more complex before it becomes alive? At what moment will it stop being a machine and become a person? There must be some boundary line, mustn't there? Well, he's thinking like there is, kind of superstitious like. Okay. You're being metaphysical. You might as well ask when can a piano compose its own symphony, just because it's being tuned to greater and greater perfection. Ben stared again at all that magnificence and complexity around him, in which he could see only an inner skin. All those millions of tons of matter, so carefully designed. Surely there could come a point when the machine was too feeble a word. Multivac remained quiet. Usually its time on its own was a medley of odd scraps of information, offhand correlations, occasionally a startling conjoining of isolated facts that set human scientists busily and excitedly to work. But now only that casual remark about George Washington, nothing more. Ben thought uneasily. It's meditating. It's deep in thought about something. He shook himself to break the mood. Joe Ciali got heavily to his feet. He said, "How could you ever tell it was alive anyway? What would be the magic giveaway?" Ben said, "Well, let's throw Multivac off on its own informational." He would be relieved to do this, and even more relieved when his week's session of interior duty would come to an end, and he could take his place outside the thing. I should say machine, I think. The thing, whatever it was. They walked to one of the main section levers and made certain it was in series lock so that its shift from one main circuit to another would simultaneously shift circuits in every one of the 100 other main sections. So, we're getting now to the very, very ending. This has been a long one because I'm presenting this whole story, but it is an invitation. Although the build-up's a little bit different the way the computer goes on, the description of the computer is clearly different, and the main difference was there's no indication that Mr. Townes had any further intention of making any further stories with either the characters in them, his Golemacher and Dictor are no Powell and Donovan that we're going to be hearing more about in other stories. Neither is this computer that Mr. Golemacher is putting together bit by bit and using and putting to use. It's just a thing, one-shot thing for a story. Multivac, on the other hand, is going to be seen in a great many stories hence. But the one thing that most unites the two stories is the way they conclude, and especially the last line. This is a spoiler. I'm going to give you, this is a spoiler alert. If you don't want to spoil the story, don't go on, because both stories conclude with, as it turns out, virtually exactly, and I do mean exactly, the same line. So, that said, if you want to pursue this, instead of tracking down the story and enjoying it yourself in some other place, either Mr. Townes' version, the originator, or Mr. Asimov's story version of it, as he accidentally appears to have copied the story very thoroughly, and like I said, the conclusion is exact. Alright, so let us continue. Ben lifted his hand, and midway in the gesture, froze. Asimov does that a lot. Somebody does something, and they have a reaction to something. And well, why is somebody acting like that? And then we learn why. It's like those scenes where somebody walks into a room, and they're just, and we're wondering, what does he see? What does he see? And sometimes they'll hold us in suspense for a little while before they finally point the camera so that we can see what's he seeing and make him act like that. He does this in print. His stories really, as written, make pretty good screenplay material. You just need more of the other details and formatting that a screenplay would be. It's like he writes like he's writing a screenplay. I wish more people would notice that and take advantage of that fact. But anyway, he froze. Multivac spoke again. That's what made him freak. What is he saying? The words tumbled grandly down the corridor, echoed back, and sounded again, while Ben and Joe stared white-faced at one another. And then Joe reached for the lever, managed to hook his finger about it, and ram it home. The voice of Multivac cut off, but Ben could still hear it, in his memory, I assume. He could hear Multivac saying over and over till cut off. And now for that last line, it says, "Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Who?" The lever was pulled. I guess that's how we know when a computer retains sentience. It wants to know who he is, or she in the case of Emmy. Emmy also has a feminine gender, as they call it, her, whatever, Emmy. Multivac seems to be a he. That's really the story. And yes, both stories end in this. Townes' story, I'll read how the final part of his, now that we can, now that we're done spoiling. As I mentioned before, shortly before that, he was going 1 and 2 and 2 is 4, 3 and 3 is 6, blah, blah, blah. Dr. Golemacher's heavy face was tired and pinched. The brilliant eyes were filling with sadness. I was taking longer to understand. The little lights went on with the tables. At 7 times 9, they stuttered a bit and came up with 61. The red light shone weakly. The alarm whispered. Carefully, the lights made up 63 and continued. Always had trouble with that one myself, the old man murmured, but he did not smile. I think it's got his engrams in it, how brains are. I don't know. Dr. Daystrom's engrams were on the M5 unit, kind of a thing. And now this kind of makes us see, I always had trouble with that one. Okay, but he did not smile. We stood side by side before the machine, which seemed to want to be close together. When the tables ended, the simple tables, there was a halt. No more advanced ones began. The lights went dark, but deep within, the illicit power was humming faintly, ponderingly. Dr. Golemacher waited as though he knew what he was waiting for. I had never noticed before how very old he was. It had never shown before. Outside, the bare trees stood like ironwork in the dim, snowy sunlight. The machine whirred again, a high-pitched sound, wholly unfamiliar. None of the lights flickered. The keys of the typing attachment at our elbows began to tremble. They jumped, fell back, jammed, fell back, rose up again. After a while of this, they began to type out something. The words were slow and far apart at first, then closer, and then hurried. The white tape rolled from the glass box, looped on the floor at our feet. First I saw the terrible look in Adam Golemacher's eyes. Then I saw the words, over and over again, was written in Emmy's own blue ink. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? So, as a result, this story didn't appear again, but there is one lone exception. You see, Mr. Townes, or anybody who knew him, never saw computers and automation, so he was not aware of this story. Meanwhile, Asimov had another opportunity to place the same story in another place. Now, this is not, unfortunately, the actual magazine that contains the story. It is a magazine called Science World. This particular one that I do have, if you look closely, is the November 19, 1959 issue. Let's get just kind of a feel for what this magazine would be like. It's kind of like a high schooler type magazine. It talks about scientific things. It has little projects you can do. 1958, look at this. New Age of Space, U.S. Air Force. Okay. Science World. It has this table of contents. Let's see here. You get various articles. Project Farsight, 2,700 miles up. You see, these are really high balloons that go way up. And rocket. Ooh. Dang. Wonder Plant of the Sea. I mean, just different, articles about different things and so forth. Dang. The Laws of Chance. Now this is kind of interesting. The Laws of Chance by Martin Gardner. Very interesting, huh? So he talks about the laws of chance, the physics of fountain pens. Yeah. In the wake of Sputnik 2, see already the second Sputnik. See, there's been not only the first, but now even the second one. U.S. steps up effort. See, the Russians have already put up 2 Sputniks, and the second had the famous dog in it. Neanderthal skeletons found in Iraq. Imagine trying to do archaeology there now. Satellite observatories planned by scientists. Science pool proposed by U.S. and Britain. News in brief, various things happen. Radar attack on weather. The moon rocket of Dr. Goddard. Look at that little article about Dr. Goddard. The moon rocket. Well, not moon rocket yet, but liquid fueled rockets for the very first time, even before Germany started taking his ideas and making the B-2 rocket. Ignitions, just different stuff. Oh, and that area for fun stuff. On the lighter side, crosswords and other little puzzles and amusements for a typical, junior high school mind. So, but it's all kind of science themed. And I think that's kind of cool. Voice beneath the sea. Anyway, you get the flavor of it. So Science World would be like that if I had, however, the August 30, 1957 issue. The second and last appearance of Isaac Asimov's story, Question, would be in that. But I don't have it. They reset this thing a couple of years later on, starting with a new issue number 1, number 2. This one, as you see, this one was volume 2, number 5. Okay, so it had just started the year before as a magazine. But it reset to volume 1 in just another year or 2 or 3. And so forth. In that restart, I found a few more, but the original volume 1 or 2, whatever this was from, this is the only one I've ever even found. So they're very, very hard to find. And like I said, I don't even have that. So it appeared there, and it was in there that Mr. Townes came across it, learned about it, and said, Dr. Asimov, or Mr. I don't know if it was Dr. or Mr. at the time, but I have a problem here. I wrote a story that was exactly that. See for yourself. It's in this location here, and you can also find it in this, and I have that. And he looks in there. There it is. Oh my goodness. That's essentially my story. So he agrees he'll never, ever publish that again. And we understand why. But I thought it's worth showing something of the story. Well, this has gone long. Thanks for listening to such a long story for such a small, short story.